I'm Michelle Shoemate, and this is the Sustained Collaboration Podcast, sponsored by the Sustained Collaboration Network. I'm a professor, consultant, and researcher who's dedicated her career to studying and improving collaboration among social impact leaders. As a result of this work, I'm convinced that collaboration is an underutilized tool for making a bigger difference in communities. On this podcast, I'll be highlighting insights from recent case study research on nonprofit collaboration, available at sustainedcollab.org. In today's episode of the podcast, I'm talking with Nico Leone, President and CEO of KERA, an NPR affiliate in Dallas. We're talking about his organization's shared project with the Dallas Morning News, the for-profit newspaper in town. And what I particularly appreciate about this project is the way that they were thoughtful in establishing a joint venture that really benefits the community by providing arts coverage, but also focusing on issues around COVID and equity and how that those are influential in the arts. More than anything, what I really wanted to highlight about KERA and the Dallas Morning News in this project is that they're embarking on sustained collaboration to solve a really pressing problem in the U.S., and that really is the changing face of journalism. According to a Northwestern University research study, the country's lost over a quarter of its newspapers since 2005 and is on track to lose a third by 2025. And in the face of this changing landscape, arts access and similar innovative solutions are needed in order to be able to sustain journalism around the country so that people get the information that they require in order to be informed citizens. I know you're going to love this conversation. Well, Nico, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Can you just start by introducing yourself and talking about your role at KERA?
Yeah, my name is Nico Leone. I'm the president and CEO at KERA in Dallas, which is a public broadcasting company. We've got a PBS station, an NPR station, a couple of music stations, and a newspaper in Denton County, and do a lot of collaborative work with other organizations.
Fantastic. And so one of the reasons why you and I got acquainted was this research that we were doing on sustained collaboration and the Arts Access Project that KERA and the Dallas Morning News came up with. And so I wonder if you can just take me back. How did that get started?
Yeah, thank you. So the Arts Access Project actually started with an introduction. One of my board members at KERA, along with a board member of the parent company of the Dallas Morning News, introduced me to Grant Moise, who's the publisher there, and thought we might find a few things to talk about as we think about how we're both trying to serve the community through journalism in Dallas. And despite our different structure, we're a 65-year-old nonprofit public media company, and they're a 160-year-old publicly traded corporation that runs, really the primary newspaper in North Texas. We found that we were really well aligned in the way we thought about journalism as service and the way we saw the changing landscape of media, and in our interest in just finding ways to serve the community better together. Just before the pandemic, they had taken their first step into community-funded journalism and had launched an education lab, a team of 5 reporters covering education locally that was philanthropically funded, and had been looking for some next steps with that, and were considering arts as a project. So KERA, through its history, and more recently, really in the last decade or so, had put a ton of effort into covering the arts across Dallas, Fort Worth, and the rest of North Texas, in part in response to the decline in arts coverage with other media. So through our conversation, I think we just came to the idea that it would be really interesting to see what would happen if we tried to do this together rather than them fundraising to build an arts reporting team that on some level could have been competitive. So the conversation really just rolled from that introduction and a mutual interest in exploring something that might be meaningful both locally and offer a potential model for others, and figuring out how to sustain the kind of journalism that we were both interested in doing.
And one of the things that I liked about how that really rolled out is that you all started small. You didn't start by building a complete, arts reporting kind of bullpen of reporters, but you started with really just focusing on what this would look like in terms of arts and COVID-19. So tell me a little more about the reason for that. Why didn't you build it out big to start out with? Why did you start small and kind of build from there?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because one of the things that I think I've learned about collaboration over time is there's not necessarily like one right way to do it or one right way to start it. And in this case, we had a really good foundation of shared trust between our two organizations. There were, people on our organization that used to work for the Dallas Morning News, board members who knew each other pretty well, a lot of mutual respect between the two newsrooms. We would occasionally work together on some smaller projects, but had never done something larger like this. And we knew, particularly with our different business models, this would be a little bit different type of collaboration than we were used to. So we had a number of questions that we needed to answer on the front end about how we might work together, whether it was in terms of the platforms that we operate on and have expertise in, whether it was business model questions, for, again, a newspaper that business model, and in particular their transition to digital is driven by a paywall and a public media company where, we're audio first and all of our content is just free and available. So we knew we had structural questions, we had business questions, and thought that it would be better to just start exploring rather than going too big first. That also gave us a little bit of time to be in sort of test and learn phase while raising some money to fund the project. Because at the end of the day, as we thought about sustainability, the fundraising also served as a little bit of proof of concept for the work. So that was a lot of the impetus to start smaller and build rather than going larger from the beginning.
And one of the things that I know in talking to people about this particular case and about arts access in your collaboration is that they're curious about what it's like to have a nonprofit organization and a for-profit journalistic organization come together and try to figure out those kind of differences that exist in terms of tempo, in terms of goals, in terms of the types of things that are first and top of mind. So can you tell me just a little bit about what that was like? Is there something unique about collaborating with a for-profit newspaper journalistic enterprise as opposed to partnering with other nonprofit organizations that folks would be interested in knowing about?
It's really interesting on some level. If we start with what is different about us, we've already gone wrong, right? I mean, you need to fully explore that and what it's going to mean. But if that's where you start, it's a little bit more difficult. I think you actually have to start with what you have in common. And at the end of the day, I think that's one of the things I really love about journalism is because whether you're at a public media company, whether you're working for a for-profit newspaper, if you're at a nonprofit startup, or really any of the ways that journalism is showing up these days in local communities, at the end of the day, journalism is about service and it's about mission and it's about serving the needs of the community. I mean, that's part of why it's baked into the First Amendment, is because of its importance. So when you talk to the people who are actually practicing journalism and on the ground, they have so much in common. And that really was what drove the collaboration, is that shared sense of service and that sense that, at this point in time, one of the things that Grant and I had in common is that belief that no single organization can actually meet those needs of the community on their own. So we knew we had enough in common that we could then look for ways to bridge our differences, right? So that took a lot of different forms. From a business model standpoint, we actually went and worked with a consulting group with BCG to do a little bit of business model work. And the question there was, we know what it could look like for us to raise money to do this together, but what does it look like to do this in a way that won't do any harm to either of our business models? So for them, it was a conversation about the paywall and content in front of the paywall and behind the paywall and what they can use to drive conversion and do this in a way that would be compatible with their business model. For us, the question really was, what will this do to our fundraising? Will this pull money away from other ways that we sustain our work, or will this come in, essentially as new revenue by getting potential donors excited about the project itself and about the collaboration. But again, the reconciliation of differences started from a shared sense of how we wanted to serve the community and a shared understanding of a need that we wanted to try to meet with this project. Specifically, the focus of Arts Access and starting was twofold. One, access and equity in the arts, trying to provide both coverage to different types of arts organizations that didn't necessarily have coverage from traditional media, while also using the work to connect with different types of audiences that aren't necessarily traditionally in the KERA or Dallas Morning News audiences, and continuing to report on economic recovery in the arts. Because as anyone who's involved in the arts knows, even at this point, almost 4 years after we started experiencing the impacts of COVID, the arts and arts organizations aren't fully back. So we identified a need that we both believed in. We had that common approach of service. And from there, we're able to work on some of the differences. That was also some of the motivation for starting a little bit smaller, because it let us tackle questions of workflow, of how content would move across platforms, of how we communicate, all of those things before scaling it, rather than going big first and then figuring out all of those things.
So, you've already started to hint at this, but I'd like to step forward to today and tell me about what Arts Access looks like now. Tell me about both in terms of how this is a truly shared project in terms of staffing, in terms of the integration with your two organizations. And then tell me a little bit about the types of coverage that you're doing these days.
Yeah, so I think, in many ways, we're still early. The project's, maybe 18 months in, not quite in terms of fully being staffed up. So in many ways, we're still in learning mode and just starting to understand the impact. The thing about collaborations, and I've been involved in a few of them, is there's almost a rhythm to it and a predictability to the types of questions you're going to have to answer and resolve between partners along the way. You don't necessarily know what the specific questions are going to be, but the types of issues that you'll encounter along the way. The team's pretty fully built at this point. We certainly leave the door open for it to take a different shape or expand in the future. The editors employed by the Dallas Morning News, the reporters are based at KERA. The content's flowing pretty smoothly, both between our digital platforms, but also between a mix of print and text-based work as well as audio work. The reporting, I think, has been really good, and I think it's really stayed true to what we said we were going to focus on. I think the team's done a great job of being out on the community and having different types of conversations with artists and arts organizations that, frankly, we weren't doing a great job of having before. And they've done a good job of continuing to tell the story just of how arts organizations are doing, what challenges they continue to experience, where they are recovering, where they aren't, and what that means for the community. So I think we've been really proud of the work, but in a lot of ways, it's still just settling in.
Mm. And you've also had some success in fundraising for the work in order to build out the team. One of the things that in talking to the folks at the Better Together Fund, who provided some of the seed funding for getting the collaboration together, where they were really excited about was that you've kind of expanded the pie in some ways. There are new organizations who came along to support this who weren't necessarily supporting journalism or weren't necessarily thinking of your traditional funders. They thought that this was something new and special.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I think that may be actually the greatest value when I think longer term, particularly at this moment in time with the level of attention that's being paid to the need for local journalism, the need to support it and sustain it in different ways, the impact on local communities. When we see the loss of local journalism, in a lot of ways, I think as we watch the trajectory, even in its early stages of the press forward conversation that's happening nationally, I think the largest impact of that may actually be the degree to which it gets people to think about the need to sustain local journalism in different ways, or it gets new people involved in helping with that work. So I think we're at such a point of flux in the business model and the sustainability for journalism on every platform and in every form. I think one of the best things that we can do as local journalism organizations is just being open to experimentation, and not in singular ways, but with others, in our communities who are doing similar work, to explore the overlap, to explore our differences, and to explore ways that together we can better serve the community, regardless of our business model or the platforms we focus on. And at the end of the day, I think that's probably one of the things I'm proudest about with this project is it does look different than a lot of other collaborations around the country. It looks different than a lot of other collaborations that we're involved in. And if we find through collaboration the right ways to sustain this work, then we've done something good.
Yeah. And, thinking about the impact of this work, I think that it really is a model for how you can make more sustainable projects, particularly in areas like the arts that have been cut back. Before this collaboration, Arts Access happened, the Dallas Morning News had cut their arts department. They'd basically cut their arts coverage. And often arts is one of the first things to go whenever we're downsizing newsrooms. And so that often means that, particularly when we're thinking about equity in the arts, those voices never get heard. It's harder for those organizations to get audiences. We become less enriched as a community because we don't know about the wonderful productions and musical kind of compositions and performances that are happening all around our cities. And so I really love this as a model, not only for sustaining great journalistic work, but also for sustaining arts and some of these other areas that we don't see a lot of. I wonder if you could just talk just briefly about what you know in terms of the community impact. What has this meant for the community in terms of who's reading the work? What are you hearing in terms of responses from arts organizations? What has this meant for your community?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, we're just starting to understand that, again, because we're still so early in the work. And we do get good feedback from artists and arts organizations who we cover. And again, I mean, it's because the team's doing good work to get to different places. We hear that it's meaningful to them, that just having organizations like the Dallas Morning News and KERA cover their work and help introduce them to audiences does make a difference to them. We're still starting to understand the audiences that we're reaching. We're understanding the right ways to approach the work in ways that will resonate with audiences. For example, one of the themes that I think we found in looking at the data for our coverage and how people are responding to it is, when we approach this through a lens of discovery, it really resonates with audience. And I think that speaks both to what the collaboration was founded to do and the right way to connect artists and arts organizations who maybe haven't been as well represented in our coverage to audiences who may in fact have an interest in their work. So we're even learning little nuances like that are helping shape our approach to the work in hearing the feedback from the community and the sort of things that are resonating with them.
Love that. So I imagine that some people have found this podcast because they're really interested in journalism. And some people have found this podcast because they're very interested in how in the world you put together a shared project between two organizations, let alone a for-profit and nonprofit organization. Yeah, this is not your first go round in collaboration. In your time at KERA and even before that, you've led your organization to make lots of different partnerships. I wonder if you could give some advice to folks who are embarking on this for maybe the first or second time, just from that kind of experience, both in terms of our access and then more broadly.
I think at the end of the day, trust is often the currency of collaboration. So finding partners that you can trust, I think for me, one of the, it's a very internal metric for success is, do we have the kind of relationship with a partner where if something isn't going well, or if we have a concern, that we can just get on a call, have a very direct conversation, work it out and have it be okay? Or do we not have enough trust to have that type of conversation? So for me, I think developing that type of a relationship is probably the biggest predictor of our ability to be successful. A second suggestion I would have is just being willing to let collaborations take on a little bit of a life of their own, and how you define them and build them, I think, taking a one-size-fits-all is almost never going to be successful if you're approaching collaboration through a lens of service, which is what we do in a nonprofit context. So centering the collaboration on something outside of yourself, in our case, how we're trying to serve the community, in Dallas and in North Texas, gave us something to focus on together. And what we both need to be concerned and make sure that the partnership is serving the needs of each of our organizations, having that sense of a greater purpose at the same time, I think is extraordinarily helpful. And then as you move through developing a conversation, just being willing to adjust and to understand that, the idea you might have started with might be completely wrong, or that you just need to learn from your community or from the audience that you're trying to serve through your partnership along the way, and not holding too tightly to your original idea and letting it take shape as you go. So I think those are a couple of the themes that I've seen work well across a pretty wide range of collaborations that we've been involved in.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge both on the podcast today and then also as part of the research that went into the Sustained Collaboration Network reports and those comparative case studies. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Michelle, and I appreciate all the work you're doing to highlight these stories.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Sustained Collaboration Podcast. The Sustained Collaboration Podcast is a joint venture between the Sustained Collaboration Network and the Network for Nonprofit and Social Impact at Northwestern University. You can learn more about the Sustained Collaboration Network and download the research referenced in this podcast at sustainedcollab.org.